Russia controls the only nuclear icebreaker fleet on Earth. Without them, the Northern Sea route does not exist. The Arctic is melting, and Moscow controls the lane. For most of human history, the top of Russia was sealed. The Arctic Ocean's sea ice covered the Russian coastline year-round. Ships couldn't transit it. Trade couldn't use it. The geography existed. The route did not. Climate change has changed that. The Arctic is warming roughly 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. Sea ice extent in the Russian Arctic has declined substantially over the past 4 decades. A shipping corridor that existed only in summer for nuclear icebreakers can now be navigated by ice-strengthened commercial vessels for a growing portion of each year. The Northern Sea route, Russia's Arctic coast from the Bering Strait to the Barents Sea, has gone from impossible to marginal to commercially significant in roughly 1 human lifetime. The route is roughly 2 weeks shorter than the Suez route for Asia to Europe trade. Every kilometer of its coastline belongs to one country. That country sets the rules for who transits, what fees they pay, what regulations they observe, and which icebreaker escorts them through icebound sections. This episode is about a shipping route that didn't viably exist a generation ago, controlled by one country, increasingly used by another, and structurally contested by a third bloc. The Northern Sea route runs along the northern coast of Russia, from the Bering Strait between Alaska and Chukotka in the east to the Barents Sea between Norway and Russia in the west. The total navigable distance is approximately 5,600 kilometers, roughly 3,500 miles. The route passes through 5 marginal seas of the Arctic Ocean: the Chukchi, East Siberian, Laptov, Kara, and Barents Seas. Russian sovereignty over the coast and the territorial sea is uncontested. What is contested, and what has been contested for decades, is how Russia treats the navigable waters offshore. The route is bounded by chokepoints at both ends. In the east, the Bering Strait, about 50 miles wide between Russia and the United States, with Diomede Islands in the middle. In the west, the route opens into the Barents Sea, which connects to the North Atlantic. Between those 2 endpoints, the Russian Arctic coastline is largely uninhabited. There are a small number of ports: Sabeta on the Yamal Peninsula, Dudinka on the Yenisei River, Pevek in Chukotka, built primarily to support resource extraction and military operations. The closest analog elsewhere on Earth is the Canadian Northwest Passage, which is shorter, shallower, and far less developed in terms of supporting infrastructure. The route's commercial value depends entirely on ice conditions. When ice covers the navigable channels, only icebreakers transit. As ice retreats, ice-strengthened commercial vessels can follow. As ice retreats further, ordinary commercial vessels can transit during peak summer windows. Climate change is making each of those windows longer. The retreat of Arctic sea ice has been one of the most consistent and dramatic signals of global climate change. National snow and ice data center measurements show that September sea ice extent, the annual minimum, has declined by roughly half compared to the late 1970s baseline. The ice that remains is also younger and thinner. Multi-year ice, the thick, multi-decade ice formations that historically dominated the Arctic Ocean, has retreated faster than first-year ice. The result is an Arctic Ocean that, in summer, increasingly contains seasonal first-year ice that breaks up and melts predictably, rather than perennial ice that needs to be navigated around. The shipping consequences became visible in 2013, when a Danish bulk carrier called the Nordic Orion became the first major commercial cargo ship to transit the Northwest Passage. The same year, Northern Sea Route transits, Russian side, increased substantially compared to historical baselines. By 2017, the first liquefied natural gas tanker, the Christophe de Margerie, made the Yamal to Asia voyage with only partial icebreaker support. Russia's Yamal LNG project, which began production in 2017, became the largest single driver of NSR transit volume. Yamal LNG ships were ice-class vessels designed specifically for the route, purpose-built to use it, not retrofitted. Total transit volumes have grown from negligible levels in the early 2000s to roughly 36 million tons in 2024. Russia has stated public targets significantly higher. In some plans, over 100 million tons annually by 2030. Most independent analysts consider those targets unrealistic given infrastructure constraints, market conditions, and continued ice variability. But the trajectory is unmistakable. A route that handled almost no commercial traffic in 2000 transports tens of millions of tons today, and the curve has been steepening since climate change accelerated. The legal framework for the Northern Sea Route is anchored in two layers. The first is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, specifically Article 234, the so-called Arctic Clause. Article 234 permits coastal states to enforce environmental regulations in ice-covered areas within their exclusive economic zones, beyond what UNCLOS otherwise permits for transit through international waters. Russia has used Article 234 as the legal basis for treating the entire NSR, including waters that would normally be high seas open to free transit, as a managed regime requiring Russian permits, fees, and icebreaker escorts. The United States and several European maritime states have formally objected to this interpretation. The interpretation has prevailed in practice. The second layer is Russian domestic law. The Russian Federation operates the Northern Sea Route Directorate, a body that grants transit permits, charges fees, mandates specific shipping conditions, and coordinates icebreaker escorts. The directorate sits within Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, which also operates the world's only fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers. Rosatomflot, Rosatom's marine division, operates 7 nuclear icebreakers, with additional vessels under construction. No other country in the world operates a nuclear icebreaker fleet. The route's transit capacity is fundamentally limited by the icebreaker fleet that can escort vessels through icebound sections. That fleet is exclusively Russian. The third layer, newer than the other two, is the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code, in force since 2017. The Polar Code establishes mandatory safety and environmental requirements for vessels operating in polar waters. It applies to all ships regardless of flag, and it imposes substantial costs on operators who want to use the route. Ice-strengthened hulls, ice navigation training, polar water operational manuals. The Polar Code is genuinely international. Russia's NSR-specific permit regime sits on top of it. Most NSR transit volume is not international through traffic from Asia to Europe. It is Russian domestic shipping, particularly Russian energy exports from Arctic resource projects to Asian buyers. Yamal LNG, the Vostok oil project, Norilsk nickel concentrate from the Yenisei River. These are the cargo flows that fill the route. The voyages are typically Sabeta or Murmansk to Chinese, Japanese, or Korean ports. International commercial transit traffic, vessels using the NSR as a substitute for Suez, exists but remains a small share. The transit as alternative to Suez story has been overstated in popular coverage. The largest non-Russian user has become China. Chinese state policy formally designated the NSR as part of a Polar Silk Road in 2017, an Arctic extension of the broader Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese companies have invested in Russian Arctic energy projects, including Yamal LNG. Chinese-flagged vessels have transited the route in growing numbers. Chinese state media has framed the Polar Silk Road as a strategic alternative to the Malacca-Suez corridor, where Chinese shipping is exposed to potential interdiction by adversarial naval powers. The Russia-China alignment around NSR development has accelerated meaningfully since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine constrained Russian access to other markets and partners. NATO members can technically transit the NSR, but face significant friction. Permits must be applied for. Fees must be paid. Russian flagged vessel preferences operate informally. Western shipping companies facing post-2022 sanctions against doing business with Russian state entities have largely withdrawn from the route. Maersk, MSC, CMA, CGM, and other major Western container shipping firms do not use NSR for regular service. The route is, in practice, available to Russian, Chinese, and select non-aligned shipping. NATO members observe, but do not participate at scale. The strategic significance of the NSR extends well beyond commercial shipping. The Russian Arctic contains substantial undeveloped hydrocarbon and mineral resources, natural gas, oil, nickel, rare earth elements, gold. Estimated Arctic hydrocarbon reserves run into hundreds of billions of dollars in potential value, much of it on the Russian side of the line. The Northern Sea Route is the logistics corridor that connects those resources to global markets. Without the route, Russian Arctic resources are stranded assets. With the route, they're a structural component of Russian export earnings. The military significance has grown in parallel. Russia has substantially modernized its northern fleet, headquartered at Severomorsk in the Kola Peninsula. Russia has reopened and expanded Arctic military bases that had been mothballed after the Soviet collapse. Facilities on Franz Josef Land, on Wrangel Island, on the Novaya Zemlya archipelago. Russia has deployed coastal defense systems and air defense systems across the Arctic coast. The militarization is partly framed as defense of the resource corridor. It also positions Russia for power projection across the Arctic itself. NATO's response, increased exercises, Norwegian and Canadian Arctic deployments, U.S. Coast Guard polar icebreaker construction, has been comparatively limited. The Arctic balance favors Russia substantially. The climate trajectory will continue to favor the route. Multiple peer-reviewed projections suggest that by mid-century, summer Arctic sea ice could be largely absent during peak months. If that projection holds, the NSR becomes navigable for a much larger fraction of each year, potentially year-round for ice-strengthened vessels. The route's commercial significance grows roughly in proportion to its navigable season. Russia is positioning for that trajectory now. The Northern Sea Route is the first major shipping corridor created by climate change. The geography existed for millions of years. The route is new. The sovereign that controls it is the country whose coastline borders it. The legal regime that regulates it sits on a UNCLOS provision other major maritime powers do not accept but cannot effectively challenge. The largest non-Russian user is a state with explicit policy goals for Arctic engagement. The Western shipping industry has largely opted out. The military balance favors the sovereign. The trajectory favors the sovereign further. Geography created the constraint. Climate change opened the route. Russia decided what happens inside it. The other major maritime powers are still deciding how to respond to the regime that already exists. This is the hinterland.